All right, folks, settle in, grab a coffee, maybe something stronger, because you are not going to believe this one. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this story is proof that reality can be far, far stranger and, frankly, more idiotic than fiction. Have you ever been woken up at 5 in the morning by an explosion so violent it rattles your teeth and makes you think a plane crashed nearby? I have. And the culprits? Well, let's just say the HOA cops from next door probably set a new world record for the fastest transition from self-proclaimed lawmen to actual inmates, all before breakfast. The best part? They had absolutely no idea that the county sheriff himself was asleep in my guest room, not 50 yards from where they decided to play demolition derby with my ranch gate using what looked suspiciously like a homemade bomb. Oh, the delicious, delicious irony. It's a long story, a crazy story, but stick with me because the ending is pure gold. My family has owned the Bar M Ranch for going on 5 generations. We're talking well over a century of blood, sweat, and tears poured into this land, nestled up against the foothills of the Blackwood Mountains. It's not just property, it's heritage, a legacy. We run cattle, grow hay, and mostly keep to ourselves. Life here is governed by the seasons, the needs of the livestock, and the steady rhythm of hard work. It was peaceful, idyllic even, until Whispering Pines luxury estate started sprouting like a particularly invasive fungus on our eastern border about 10 years ago. Suddenly, our quiet corner of the county was besieged by folks who seemed to think they'd bought into a Disney movie, not a working agricultural landscape. Their houses were huge, uniformly beige, and packed closer together than sardines in a tin, each with a meticulously manicured lawn that probably consumed more water than my entire herd. And of course they came with a homeowners association, the bane of many a property owner's existence. The initial grumblings were predictable. Complaints about the smell of manure, a smell I personally associate with honest work and a healthy ecosystem. Letters about the mooing of cattle at ungodly hours like, dawn. My personal favorite was the official grievance about the visual pollution of my 50-year-old tractor, which I occasionally had to park near the fence line we shared. I tried to be neighborly at first. I attended a couple of their early HOA meetings, attempting to explain that a ranch is, well, a ranch. I pointed out that we were here long before Whispering Pines was even a gleam in a developer's eye. My explanations were met with blank stares, or worse, condescending little smiles from a man named Arthur Abernathy, the self-appointed king of Whispering Pines and HOA president. Abernathy was one of those men whose sense of self-importance seemed to inflate with every syllable he uttered. He favored pastel polo shirts, a size too small, straining over a prosperous belly, and drove a gleaming black Escalade that he probably polished more than he spoke to his own wife. He had a way of looking down his nose at you, even if you were taller, which I am. He made it clear he viewed our ranch as an unfortunate, rustic stain on his otherwise perfect suburban tapestry. He once unironically referred to his domain as the Riviera of the Rockies, which told me everything I needed to know about his grip on reality. We were just the unsightly service entrance to his imagined paradise. The minor annoyances escalated slowly but surely. Little notes left on our fence posts about weeds, which were actually native wildflowers. Demands that we move a particular watering trough because its rustic aesthetic clashed with their community standards. I largely ignored them, filing the increasingly passive-aggressive, then overtly aggressive, letters in a growing folder I labeled Abernathy's Follies. I figured he was mostly hot air, a petty tyrant in a small pond. I underestimated the depths of his delusion and the lengths to which he'd go to assert his imaginary authority. The first real sign that things were about to get serious, beyond just paper-based warfare, was when Abernathy, in his infinite wisdom, decided Whispering Pines needed its own private security force. Not just a sleepy guard in a booth, mind you, but actual tactical gear-wearing, wannabe commandos patrolling their pristine cul-de-sacs in golf carts, modified to look like miniature police cruisers. He hired 2 specimens who looked like they'd been rejected from every actual law enforcement agency and a few amateur paintball leagues for being too intense. We quickly nicknamed them Rambo and Terminator. This, my friends, is where the story starts to get truly wild, because these weren't just neighborhood watch volunteers. Abernathy had somehow convinced them and himself that they were a legitimate constabulary, And their primary target, it seemed, was my ranch. I should have known then that Abernathy wasn't just going to stop at strongly worded letters. His ego was a runaway train, and my ranch gate was apparently standing right on the tracks. The calm before the storm was ending, and the first gusts of an absolutely idiotic hurricane were beginning to blow. The arrival of Rambo and Terminator, or as they preferred to be called, Chief Security Officer Jenkins and Deputy Officer Miller, heralded a new era of absurdity. Jenkins, Rambo, was a portly fellow whose tactical vest looked like it was holding on for dear life. He had a perpetually angry red face, mirrored sunglasses that he wore even indoors, and a utility belt laden with so much gear, oversized flashlight, handcuffs, a taser he clearly longed to use, and what looked suspiciously like a novelty oversized sheriff's badge that he clanked when he walked. Miller, Terminator, was tall, unnervingly silent, and possessed the kind of dead-eyed stare that made you wonder if he was processing your existence or just calculating the optimal trajectory to disable you. They took their jobs with a religious fervor, patrolling the beige labyrinth of Whispering Pines like it was Fallujah. Their initial forays onto my property were tentative. They'd parked their tactical golf cart 1, as it was grandly labeled, just on their side of the fence and stare. Sometimes they'd take notes. Once, Rambo yelled through a cheap megaphone that one of my cows was loitering with intent near the fence line. The cow, Bessie, just chewed her cud and looked unimpressed. I was starting to feel like Bessie. But Abernathy, fueled by whatever power trip was currently consuming him, clearly wasn't satisfied with mere observation. The citations began. These were official-looking documents, printed on Whispering Pines letterhead, detailing various infractions. I got one for unauthorized agricultural odors, another for excessive bovine vocalizations during designated quiet hours. My personal favorite was for failure to maintain aesthetic harmony with community standards, citing a patch of perfectly healthy alfalfa that apparently offended their delicate suburban sensibilities. These citations, of course, had no legal standing whatsoever. My ranch wasn't part of their HOA, not subject to their ridiculous bylaws. I knew this. They, deep down, probably knew this too, but Abernathy was a master of bluster. He clearly believed that if he acted like he had authority, people would just fold. He was in for a surprise with me. I took each citation, made a copy for my Abernathy's Follies file, and then ceremoniously used the original to light the burn barrel. I did, however, start taking things more seriously in terms of documentation. I installed a few more security cameras along the perimeter, the kind that were discreet but high definition. I made sure my ranch hands knew to record any interactions with Rambo and Terminator on their phones. I also had a chat with my lawyer, Ben Carter, an old college buddy who specialized in property law. Ben listened to the whole saga, alternating between snorting with laughter and shaking his head in disbelief. "This Abernathy fellow sounds like a classic case of small pond, big fish syndrome," Ben said. "Legally, they can't touch you. But guys like this can make your life miserable with nuisance tactics. Document everything. Every letter, every encounter, every absurd citation. We want a paper trail so thick it'll choke a donkey if they ever try anything truly stupid." Prophetic words, as it turned out. The first direct confrontation with Rambo and Terminator on my land wasn't long in coming. I was out checking a fence line on my ATV, well within my own property, when their golf cart came bouncing over the slight rise that marked the unofficial boundary, lights flashing. Yes, they had flashing lights. They pulled up, blocking my path. Rambo waddled out, hand resting on his taser. "Sir, this is a restricted access area," he puffed, his voice trying for authoritative but mostly sounding winded. "Says who?" I asked, cutting the engine on my ATV. "Says the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Security Department," Terminator intoned from the passenger seat, his voice flat and mechanical. I had to bite back a laugh. "Fellas," I said, keeping my tone even, "this is the Bar M Ranch. It's been the Bar M Ranch since your grandpappies were in diapers. You are currently trespassing. I suggest you point that glorified go-kart back the way you came before I call the actual sheriff." Rambo's face got even redder. "We are conducting official HOA business. Mr. Abernathy has authorized us to patrol this border region to ensure compliance with community covenants," he blustered. "Your community covenants end at that fence line, Rambo," I said, gesturing with my thumb. "And my patience is ending right about now. Get off my land." For a moment, I thought Rambo might actually try something. His hand tightened on his taser. Terminator just stared. Then, common sense, or perhaps a flicker of self-preservation, seemed to penetrate their tactical delusions. They muttered something about filing a report and reluctantly retreated. This little encounter clearly bruised Abernathy's ego because a week later, the formal threatening letter arrived. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, probably some cut-rate outfit Abernathy found online, and it was a masterpiece of baseless accusations and puffed-up legalese. The gist of it was that my main ranch gate, the big sturdy one with the Bar M brand burned into the overhead arch, was an unauthorized encroachment on a supposed historic Whispering Pines access easement and also violated their aesthetic code. It demanded the gate's immediate removal within 7 days, or they would take all necessary actions to remove the obstruction and bill the Bar M Ranch for all associated costs. This was pure fantasy. There was no such easement. My property deeds were ironclad. And their aesthetic code had about as much jurisdiction over my gate as it did over the moon. Ben Carter drafted a polite but unequivocal reply, citing the relevant property laws, deed records, and basically telling Abernathy and his ambulance-chasing lawyer to go pound sand. We sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. Abernathy signed for it himself. I imagined his face turning that delightful shade of purple he favored when thwarted. The 7-day deadline came and went. The gate remained. I figured that would be the end of it. Surely, even Abernathy wasn't stupid enough to actually try and physically remove my gate. Oh, how wrong I was. His definition of all necessary actions was apparently far more literal and far more insane than I could have possibly imagined. He was about to escalate this suburban squabble into something that would make headlines. The week after Abernathy received Ben's firm rebuttal regarding my offending gate, an uneasy quiet settled over the fence line. Rambo and Terminator were still visible, doing their little patrols in their glorified golf cart, but they kept their distance, mostly just glaring from afar. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a thunderstorm, heavy and charged. I found myself scanning the tree line more often, a prickle of unease at the back of my neck. It was during this period that my old friend Sheriff Jim Thompson called. Jim and I went way back, high school football teammates, and we'd kept in touch over the years. He was a good man, solid, no nonsense, and dedicated to his job, which, in a sprawling rural county like ours, was often more about community relations and dealing with lost livestock than high-octane crime. "Hey there, you old cattle rustler," his familiar voice boomed over the phone. "Got a long weekend coming up. Thought I might take you up on that offer to come out to the ranch. My wife says I need to de-stress, and staring at your ugly mug for a couple of days sounds less stressful than another town council meeting." I laughed. "Ugly mug aside, the guest room's always ready for you, Jim. Come on out. We can do some fishing down at the creek, maybe even call in a coyote or two if you're feeling adventurous." Peace and quiet guaranteed. Little did I know how ironic that peace and quiet promise would turn out to be. Jim arrived on a Friday afternoon, looking tired but relieved to be out of his uniform and in jeans and a flannel shirt. We spent the evening on the porch, drinking iced tea, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. I filled him in on the ongoing saga with Whispering Pines, Abernathy, and his dynamic duo of mall ninjas. Jim listened patiently, occasionally shaking his head or letting out a low whistle. "Abernathy, what www?" he mused, swirling the ice in his glass. "Yeah, I've had a few dealings with him, mostly traffic complaints and lost poodles. The man definitely has an elevated opinion of his own importance. Private security, huh? With tactical gear? Sounds like he's playing mayor of his own little kingdom." He was sympathetic but understandably couldn't offer much beyond general advice unless an actual law was broken on my property. "Just keep documenting everything," he reiterated, echoing Ben's counsel. "People like that often hang themselves with their own rope if you give them enough of it." At the time, I didn't realize Abernathy was preparing to hand them an entire shipping container's worth of rope, along with a blasting cap. Saturday was uneventful, peaceful even. Jim and I repaired a section of fence. He was surprisingly handy for a desk jockey sheriff, and then spent a few lazy hours by the creek, though the fish weren't biting. The only slight disturbance was when one of my ranch hands, young Billy, reported that Rambo and Terminator had parked their golf cart directly opposite my main gate for nearly an hour, just sitting there, watching. Billy said Rambo was using binoculars. It was unnerving but not overtly illegal. They're trying to intimidate you, Jim said when I told him. Classic bully tactic. Ignore them. Don't give them the reaction they want. That evening, as we sat down to a steak dinner, I couldn't shake a feeling of foreboding. It was a subtle disquiet, like the air pressure dropping before a big storm. I mentioned it to Jim. Probably just Abernathy getting under your skin, he said, though he looked thoughtful. Still, pays to be vigilant. We turned in relatively early. Jim had the guest room at the front of the house, overlooking the driveway and the main gate, which was about 100 yards down the gravel track. I remember thinking as I drifted off to sleep that at least with the sheriff on site, Abernathy's goons would surely have the sense to lie low. That was perhaps my most significant miscalculation in this whole affair. Underestimating the boundless stupidity of men with a grievance and a misplaced sense of authority is a dangerous game. The next morning, just before dawn, that stupidity was going to announce itself with a deafening roar. The explosion ripped through the pre-dawn stillness at precisely 4:58 a.m. It wasn't just a loud bang, it was a concussive force that shook the entire ranch house, rattling windows in their frames and sending a framed picture of my grandparents crashing to the floor. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering against my ribs. My first thought, in that disoriented, adrenaline-fueled moment, was an earthquake or maybe a gas line exploding. Then, through the ringing in my ears, I heard the distinct, panicked bellowing of cattle and the frantic barking of my dogs. I was out of bed in an instant, pulling on jeans and boots, my mind racing. What in the Sam Hill was that? As I fumbled for my flashlight, I heard movement from the guest room. Jim Thompson, a man clearly accustomed to being jolted awake and into action, was already in the hallway, looking grim. He was still in his pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, but his eyes were wide awake and sharp. What the hell was that? He growled, his voice all sheriff, no friendly fishing buddy. No idea, I replied, heading for the front door. But it sounded like it came from the direction of the main gate. We burst out onto the porch, flashlights cutting through the inky darkness. The air was thick, with the acrid smell of smoke and something else. Something chemical and sharp, like spent fireworks, but much, much stronger. In the distance where my main gate should have been, there was only a flickering orange glow and a chaotic silhouette of twisted metal. Stay here, might not be safe. Jim barked, already moving towards his county-issued truck parked beside my pickup. He was reaching for something on the passenger seat, but I wasn't about to stay put. This was my ranch, my gate. Adrenaline trumped caution. I sprinted towards my own truck, grabbing the heavy-duty maglite I keep under the seat. As we neared the end of the driveway, our headlights illuminated a scene of utter devastation. My beautiful, sturdy Bar M gate, the one with the family brand that had stood for decades, was gone. In its place was a mangled heap of wood and steel, splintered posts, and a crater in the gravel track that looked like a small meteor had hit. And standing beside the wreckage, silhouetted against the flickering flames of some still-burning timbers, were two figures. Even in the dim, chaotic light, their ridiculous tactical vests were unmistakable. Rambo and Terminator, Jenkins and Miller. They were just standing there, Rambo holding something that looked like a remote detonator, both of them looking smug. Unbelievably, appallingly smug. Then Jim Thompson, still in his pajamas, but now, with his service weapon drawn and his badge clipped to his t-shirt, stepped into the glare of my headlights. "County Sheriff, don't move." "Hands where I can see them," he roared, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of authority that no amount of Abernathy's bluster could ever mimic. The transformation in Rambo and Terminator was instantaneous and almost comical. Their smug expressions vanished, replaced by a look of utter, slack-jawed disbelief, like two coyotes who'd cornered a rabbit only to find it was a grizzly bear in disguise. Rambo dropped the detonator as if it had suddenly become red hot. Sheriff? What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice several octaves higher than his usual pseudo-authoritative baritone. Terminator just froze, his eyes, for once, showing something other than blank indifference, pure, unadulterated panic. "I'm wondering what you two are doing blowing up private property at 5 in the morning with an improvised explosive device." Jim snapped back, advancing cautiously, his weapon steady. This is an official HOA action, Rambo blurted out, desperately trying to reclaim some shred of his imagined authority. Mr. Abernathy ordered us to remove this illegal gate. It's an obstruction. Jim didn't even blink. Mr. Abernathy doesn't have the authority to order a ham sandwich outside his own kitchen, let alone authorize the use of explosives. You two are under arrest for malicious destruction of property, illegal use of an explosive device, reckless endangerment, and about half a dozen other felonies I'll think of on the way to the station. Turn around, hands behind your backs, now! The click of handcuffs ratcheting shut was one of the most satisfying sounds I'd ever heard. As Jim read them their Miranda rights, Rambo kept babbling. You can't arrest us. We're officers of the Whispering Pines Security Department. This is a misunderstanding. Jim just looked at him, his expression one of weary disgust. Son, he said, his voice flat. Right now, you're two idiots in cheap tactical gear who just committed a very serious crime on my watch. And you're about to find out that real jail is a lot less fun than playing cops and robbers in your golf cart. The sun was just beginning to peek over the mountains, casting a golden light on the scene of their utter, self-inflicted ruination. It was, I thought, a rather beautiful sunrise. The arrival of Jim's deputies was swift. The flashing blue and red lights cutting through the dawn mist felt surreal against the backdrop of my smoldering gate and two bewildered-looking HOA officers sitting cuffed on the tailgate of Jim's truck. Rambo had finally shut up, his face a pale, doughy mask of terror. Terminator was still silent, but his usual impassive expression was replaced by one that suggested he was mentally replaying every bad decision that had led him to this moment. The deputies, professional and efficient, began securing the scene, taping off the area around the crater and taking photographs. The bomb squad was called from the county seat to examine the debris and what was left of the device. It turned out to be a significant amount of illegally obtained commercial-grade blasting agent, crudely wired to a remote detonator, far more powerful and dangerous than even I had initially suspected. These morons could have killed someone. They could have killed me or Jim if we'd been any closer or if the shrapnel had flown differently. The smug satisfaction I'd felt at their arrest was now tinged with a cold anger at their reckless stupidity. Once the initial chaos subsided and Rambo and Terminator were hauled away in separate patrol cars, still protesting their official HOA duty to any deputy who would listen, which was none of them, Jim turned to me. He looked tired, but there was a grim set to his jaw. Well, he said, running a hand through his already messy hair, so much for a quiet weekend. He clapped me on the shoulder. You all right? I nodded, still a bit dazed. Yeah, just processing the sheer idiocy of it all. They actually blew up my gate. Jim grunted. They did. And now they're going to pay for it. And so is your friend Abernathy, if he's as involved as these two clowns are already trying to make out. Apparently, Rambo, once safely ensconced in the back of a cruiser and realizing the gravity of his situation, had started singing like a canary under a spotlight, trying to pin the whole idea on Abernathy. Terminator, true to his namesake, remained largely silent, but the evidence at the scene, including the detonator Rambo had dropped, was pretty damning on its own. Later that morning, after the bomb squad had cleared the scene and I'd given my official statement, two deputies paid a visit to Whispering Pines luxury estates, specifically to the residence of Mr. Brock's HECP, Arthur Abernathy. I wasn't there, of course, but I heard about it later from Jim, and it was, by all accounts, a glorious spectacle. Abernathy, likely woken by the distant boom and perhaps wondering if his boys had successfully completed their mission, was apparently in his silk pajamas and monogrammed robe when the deputies arrived. He initially tried to bluster, to assert his HOA presidential authority, even threatening to call his, probably imaginary, powerful friends. But the deputies weren't Rambo and Terminator. They were actual law enforcement, armed with actual authority and a warrant. When presented with the preliminary statements from his captured security chiefs and the evidence of a felony conspiracy to commit destruction of property using an explosive device, Abernathy's composure reportedly crumbled like a day-old croissant. His face went from indignant puce to a sickly, chalky white. He was arrested and led out of his beige palace in handcuffs, much to the shock and awe of his perfectly manicured neighbors, who were just emerging for their morning power walks and gluten-free muffin runs. The self-proclaimed King of Whispering Pines, a man whose ego probably had its own zip code, was dethroned before he'd even had his imported coffee. The legal fallout was, as Ben Carter gleefully put it, a beautiful train wreck for them. A symphony of justice for us. Rambo, Jenkins, and Terminator, Miller, were charged with a raft of felonies, including possession and use of an illegal explosive device, conspiracy, aggravated destruction of property, and reckless endangerment. Facing serious prison time, they both quickly flipped completely, providing detailed testimony about Abernathy's explicit instructions to remove the gate by any means necessary, and how he'd even helped them procure the special fireworks that turned out to be blasting. Agents? Probably through some shady online contact. Abernathy, despite hiring a surprisingly expensive lawyer, found himself facing similar charges. His attempts to paint himself as a concerned community leader misled by overzealous employees fell flat against the evidence and the testimony of his former minions. The criminal trials were swift. Jenkins and Miller, having cooperated, received reduced sentences but still ended up with several years in state prison, a far cry from patrolling cul-de-sacs. Abernathy, the mastermind, got a heftier sentence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who clearly had little patience for vigilante HOAs, made an example of him. His Escalade was probably repossessed before he even finished his first prison meal. On the civil side, Ben Carter had a field day. We sued Abernathy personally, Jenkins, Miller, and the Whispering Pines HOA as an entity. The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA's insurance company, faced with the undeniable proof of gross negligence and criminal activity orchestrated by their president, settled relatively quickly for a very significant sum. It covered the cost of a new, even grander gate, custom-forged steel this time, with a reinforced concrete base. Let them try that again. Compensation for damages, emotional distress, and all legal fees. More importantly, the lawsuit and the criminal conviction sent shockwaves through Whispering Pines. The HOA board was dissolved in disgrace. Abernathy's cronies were ousted. A new, much more reasonable group of residents took over, horrified by what had happened and eager to make amends. The Whispering Pines Security Department was, of course, immediately and permanently disbanded. Their golf cart was reportedly sold for parts. The new HOA leadership actually approached me, apologized profusely, and we managed to establish a surprisingly amicable relationship. They even asked for my input on sensible landscaping along our shared border that wouldn't involve demands to remove 100-year-old oak trees. I rebuilt the Bar M gate, bigger and stronger than before, a clear statement that we weren't going anywhere. Sheriff Jim Thompson, thankfully, got his quiet weekend eventually, though he did joke that his wife now thinks my ranch is a high-risk combat zone. The whole ordeal was a masterclass in how unchecked ego and a petty desire for control can lead to spectacularly self-destructive consequences. Abernathy thought he was a king ruling his little fiefdom, but he was just a bully with a polo shirt and a misplaced sense of entitlement. He, Rambo, and Terminator learned the hard way that there's a very big difference between playing at authority and respecting the actual law. And they learned that sometimes the quiet rancher next door might just have the county sheriff sleeping in his guest room. You just never know. So, what's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride, and I'll catch you on the next one.